Welcome, everyone, to another episode of It's a Wrap with Rap. I'm your host, Ron Rappaport. I would like to thank all our great listeners, viewers, supporters, and sponsors for helping to make this podcast such a success. We are being heard in all 50 states, all provinces of Canada, and over 70 countries around the world on all major platforms and on the podcast website. Please visit the podcast website, itsawrapwithrap.com, to find all the episodes, previews of future episodes, and great products and services from our sponsors. This podcast features people who have overcome life's challenges and adversities, people who can inspire, motivate, and educate us on an assortment of topics. My guest today is Sandy Kirkham. Sandy is a voice and advocate in the area of clergy sexual abuse. Sandy was sexually abused at age 16 in 1971 by her youth pastor in the Protestant church. He was 30, married, and had 2 children. Sandy was not his first victim nor his last. The abuse lasted 5 years until his actions were discovered. He was given a going-away party and moved to the next church, and Sandy was called by the elders and told to leave the church because of her behavior. Sandy remained silent for 27 years until a trigger factor forced her to face the truth. In 2018, she wrote the book, Let Me Pray Upon You, about the abuse and subsequent 27-year journey of healing. She is here today to talk to us about her story and overcoming her trauma. Welcome, Sandy, to the podcast.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
It's good to have you here, and thank you for coming here and talking about a very sensitive topic. Would you please introduce yourself by telling us about your growing up years, your family dynamics, and when you first became involved in the church setting?
I grew up in a family that was happy childhood, but had some issues because at the time I was 7, my parents divorced, and that was very traumatic for me. They divorced. We moved in with my stepfather, and my mother had a baby right away, and it was a lot of upheaval in my life at that time. But as most kids do, I learned to adapt and just work through it as a kid, but it did create anxiety and some insecurities in my life. One of the best things that happened to me was when I was 8, my best friend up the street invited me to go to church with her. And from the moment I stepped foot into the doors, I loved every bit of it. I went to church camp, Bible school, did all the things that every kid did in a Protestant church, but I loved it. As I grew older, I began to sing in the choir. I taught Sunday school. It was just a place that I really loved. And it was a place I felt like I could land safely and felt loved by those in the church because like I said, my household, because I didn't see my dad very much. I was sad about that. And I was embraced by all of these people. I loved the youth pastor that we had, but shortly after I turned 16, and that moment on, I was going to be on a path that I never could have imagined and never dreamt I would ever have to live. And evil entered my life at that time. I was 16. He came to our church from another church in Georgia. He was very charismatic, very dynamic. He came with new ideas. This was in the 70s, so he was kind of cool and hip. He had sideburns. He dressed like the kids did. He drove a convertible. He went to our football games. So, everybody just surrounded him because he was so new and different, and everyone loved him. His sermons were dynamic. There was just a presence about him that people were drawn to him. Well, I was very active in the church prior to his coming. So when he came to our youth group as a youth pastor, it was to no one's surprise that he tapped into me to be one of the leaders. And so he kind of took me under his wings right away and made me feel special. I enjoyed the attention that he gave me, but I only saw it as a way that I was helping the church. I never saw anything that led me to believe that he had anything but good intentions.
Now, were your parents at all religious people?
Say that again.
Were your parents religious at all?
No, they were not. My mother eventually did join the church, and she did that because of this pastor. He was, always encouraging people to come and join the church. So she eventually joined the church, but at the time I was going to the church during my teenage years, she was not involved at all, which is, to look for someone who doesn't have parents' eyes on them right there. And she thought, being in church, this was the 70s, people were into drugs and free love. And I was in church, what safer place could her daughter be to be in a church?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. This new youth pastor that you were talking about, did he bring a lot of new people into the church?
Absolutely. He came first as our youth pastor. We had about 25 kids. By the time he was promoted to senior minister, we had over 200 kids coming to the church. And not only did he bring in young people to the church, but adults were coming as well. As I said, his sermons were dynamic. If the mega churches had existed at that time, he certainly would have been in charge of one of them. People thought he walked on water. He could do no wrong. And the church exploded in numbers and financially with his leadership. It didn't expand spiritually, but it certainly did in numbers and financially, which was, one of the things that I think people decided that he was worth keeping even after they were aware of his behavior.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. If he's bringing in all those new people, he's bringing in money.
Right. And
So,
again, people loved him because one of the things that especially clergy abusers do is that they will also groom and manipulate the entire congregation. They get them to see them as this wonderful, do no wrong, so that if there's an accusation made, people are stunned and don't want to believe it, or they think the accuser is the one that's got the issue or the problem. So they really do groom and manipulate the entire congregation to a point where they refuse to see that this man is capable of doing what he was accused of. And that was certainly the case with me.
yeah,
No one wanted to believe that he had done this, and I was blamed. I literally was blamed for his behavior. Um, when he was caught, he was called in by the elders. He was allowed to tell his story of whatever he wanted to say. I had no idea what narrative he gave them. I was never called in and asked any questions. I was told where I was to sit in church, how I was to behave. If anyone asked me a question, I was to direct them to the elders. I was told by the elders not to even tell my parents. That's
wow,
how much of a secret they wanted to keep this. And it was all in an effort then to getting to the next church before more people found out. The problem is when one or two people know, those secrets don't stay secretive. And so as rumors started going throughout the church, people started suspecting things and asking questions to a point that he was told that he needed to address the congregation. So on a Sunday morning, he simply got up and said, "I'm a man of God who has faults. I've sinned against my wife. I've sinned against God, and I ask your forgiveness." And that was all he said. And the following day, he called me and wanted me to meet him in a hotel room for sex. But no one knew that. They only saw this man who looked like he was broken and decided that he wanted forgiveness, and he was forgiven.
yeah.
That was the way it was.
Tell us, Sandy, when did things started uh going off kilter or becoming uncomfortable with him? Uh, how soon after he landed at your church did that all ensue?
He came to our church in about March, and that Christmas, it would be about 6, 7 months later, we were having a meeting at my house. And again, remember, up to this point, he's now had 6, 7 months to tell me how wonderful I am. He's put me in positions on committees. He's made me feel like I'm, this wonderful person helping the church. And so I'm elated. I feel like I'm doing God's work at this point. But at Christmas time, we had a meeting at my house. He waited for everyone else to leave. And he slowly stopped me in my hallway and told me how much he appreciated the work I was doing in the church. He began caressing my face. And then he bent down and he kissed me. And I stood there stunned because I thought, I think he just kissed me, but he's my pastor and he wouldn't be doing anything he shouldn't be doing. And he was also always very demonstrative to everyone. He was always hugging people. He was always telling people how much he loved them. It wasn't like I love you in Christ or I love you as a brother a sister in Christ, he would literally say, I love you. And so those boundaries were kind of blurred prior to that. So when he kissed me, I just didn't know how to respond to it. I wasn't sure what I was supposed to do. And so the only way I could process it was that I misunderstood, and it was just his way of showing his appreciation. Now, I did babysit for his family. His wife worked evenings, and so that gave him the perfect opportunity to be alone with me 2 or 3 nights a week. And so sometimes he would hug me when I was finished babysitting. Sometimes he wouldn't. It was all so confusing so that I couldn't figure out what was happening. And this took about a year of maybe kissing me and not kissing me. So for about a year, that's all that was until one night, after the kids were in bed, he took me to the living room and put me on the floor and began undressing me. And that's when I knew that's the time I was scared. I thought this is something that shouldn't be happening. I kept thinking he was going to stop, and he didn't. And I froze. I literally froze. And I talk about this chapter in my book and how I literally just thought of anything and everything else, what was happening to me. And he had sex with me that night. And once he crossed that line, I knew that was wrong, but I didn't know what else to do with it. And of course, at that point, he's telling me, I love you, I need you in my ministry, and this is God's will, and we need to do this together, and you can't tell anyone. And then he was kind of fine in that point, but then all of a sudden he kind of got angry and said, and you do know, if you tell anyone, no one's going to believe you. And of course, I'm thinking, of course they're not going to believe me because I don't even believe this has just happened to me. So
Right.
the sex continued because I just didn't know how to get out of it. And part of me didn't want to hurt him. Part of me liked this person to some extent because he was such a wonderful person. So, at 16, 17 years old, I was totally confused. And so at that point, I just thought this is what I'm going to have to do. This is what I'm supposed to do, and I'm going to do it and keep this secret. I felt really like I was in a black hole with no way out. That's really how I felt. Oh, it was wrong. I was old enough then to know that this wasn't right. But the gaslighting of telling me how God's will, he said we were married in God's eyes. It was all, he used scripture to tell me how much I was needed to do this. And I accepted it because I didn't know what else to do. I didn't feel like I could tell anyone. I knew that if I told anyone, first of all, I wasn't sure I would be believed, but then I also knew it would be a bombshell to come out with this kind of information. Even though I knew that he had done this once before, they accepted him then. Why would they not accept him a second time?
So did he do this once before with a congregant?
Yes. When he came to our church, I would say about a month after he arrived at our church, a young girl from his first church came forward and accused him of inappropriate behavior. When he was confronted by the elders and the current minister, he did not deny it. He said he was wrong. It was a mistake. He would never do it again. They believed him. They didn't give any information out to the congregation. And within 6 months, he was kissing me in my hallway. And again, the sex and the abuse, he became physically abusive as well. It was, like I said, I was in a black hole with no way out. Even though there were people around me that I probably could have trusted, I didn't. And it lasted for 5 years till he was caught.
The one question I have is, you said you babysat for him.
Yes.
Okay. So, but he was there when you babysat? He was in the house?
Okay, I lost you a minute.
Oh. Um,
I hear you now.
okay. I'm a little confused about the babysitting thing.
Mm-hmm.
Was he in the house with you when you were babysitting?
Yes, so I didn't have a car to drive then, so he would have to pick me up and take me home. His wife worked evenings, and so once the kids were in bed, initially what he would do is say, let's sit and talk about the Bible. I want you to read some books on spirituality. We would talk about the church. He would ask me what I thought about his sermons. I'm feeling very special and like an adult kind of, here's this wonderful man ask me what I think of his sermons. So initially that's how it started, just sitting around talking about church, and then he would decide it was time to take me home.
Okay,
And he always came home soon after she would leave.
so you were kind of a quasi babysitter caretaker.
Yeah,
Okay. Did his wife have any idea what was going on?
not initially. She eventually became suspicious later on. Now, you have to keep in mind, he was also abusive to her as well.
Okay.
Um, they did
Okay.
not have a good relationship. I observed that because I was in their home a lot. I saw him throw a book at her one time and hit her in the back of the head. He was very degrading to her. She was never smart enough. She wasn't pretty enough. And eventually, those were things he said to me as the relationship continued. And I became more and more involved in the relationship and almost trusting him to say, this is the way it's going to be. He became a different person. I was no longer this wonderful person. I was a person who wasn't smart. He would have me memorize a vocabulary word every week to say, I'm trying to improve you because you're not very smart and you need to learn to speak in these words. And it was a Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde kind of thing.
Yeah.
And what trauma does is it forces your brain not to think in a manner that makes sense. When you're traumatized, your brain has to protect itself. And so it tends to then say, this is an acceptable behavior. But I did try to get out of the relationship a couple times. There were times when I went to him and I said, I can't do this. This is wrong. I feel guilty. And he would respond in one of two ways. One, he would be very loving and very kind, beg me to stay, saying he couldn't live without me, that the ministry depended upon me and him together. The other way that he responded, he would either push me up against the wall, become very angry, and say to me, I'm the only one that knows how to love you. You're no longer a virgin, and no one's going to want you anymore but me. And, those were just things that he pounded into my head. And I finally believed all those things.
Yeah,
I
and
truly believe that
you were only what, 16, 17?
17.
Yeah. Yeah. So you know, you didn't have that mentality yet to really cope with all this. Uh, Now you said after your relations ensued, he changed and he was abusive toward you and you became fearful. Now, what, in your opinion, makes the clergy different from other forms of sexual abuse? What have you concluded
Well,
from that?
one of the things is the fact that they're given without questioning them. So they've already got their foot in the door without having to do much of anything because they're the pastor. It also affects your life spiritually in a way that other abuse doesn't. So if you're sexually abused by a family member, and listen, all abuse is horrific, but when
Yeah.
it happens in the church, they're touching an intimate part of your soul. They're taking your faith and using it against you. They're weaponizing what you believe and turning it into something evil. And so for me, he contaminated my spiritual life. He contaminated a very special part of my soul that I can't get back. My faith and my belief in God was has changed. It's not the same as it was before. And I certainly am very uncomfortable in a church. We had sex in the church. I can't, I would watch him preach on Sunday mornings after he'd had sex with me on a Saturday night. And those kinds of things don't ever leave you. They don't leave you. So when clergy cross those boundaries, it is it just devastates the soul. And many victims will never find their faith and will never return to a church. And that's very sad because the church is not meant to do that. It's a place that
No,
should be safe, and it's not.
I
I
mean,
talk about that in my chapter. It's called Spiritual Wounds, and I talk about how it affected me spiritually.
yeah, I mean, as far as I'm concerned, just listening to this, and I can imagine the audience listening to this. I mean, somebody like this, that pastor, they're the worst kind of people. I mean,
They are.
I just don't think they can get any lower. They're using God. They're weaponizing the
Yeah.
faith. I mean, it just doesn't get any worse than that. And
And they look for and they take the most vulnerable, whether it's someone,
yeah,
a child who's being bullied, a child that's from a dysfunctional home. It could be a woman who's going through a divorce, a woman who's had prior abuse. That vulnerability is what they look for. And the church is full of vulnerable people because so many people come to the church seeking help and they want that spiritual connection. And they meet this person who pretends that they're helping them, who pretends that they're going to take care of them, and it actually uses their own vulnerabilities against them because they tend to, I'm going to help you. I'm going to be a part of who making you feel better. And then they use that against them. They literally use it against them. And you're right, it's probably the lowest form.
yeah,
And what's worse is the church then doesn't respond in the right way. The church now supports these men. Sometimes they hide it. They don't, they let them go out of the ministry for a year to get counseling and they bring them back in. These men have lost that privilege in ministry. They should not be returned to ministry, whether it's a priest, a rabbi, or a pastor. They've lost that privilege by their own. And yet that's not the norm for a lot of churches. They're returned back. And I became a victim because my church allowed him, after knowing he had sexual relations with a young girl in his first church, and never told anyone in the congregation. Now I'm going to give you a jaw-dropping wow moment. This man is still in the ministry.
yeah. I was going to get to that, and I was going to moving on. The pastor is transferred to another church, and believe it or not, the elders, well, two elders, give him a going away send-off party. They
Mhm.
apparently knew about this relationship going on. And then they have the audacity to tell you, a 17-year-old, to leave the church and told you that you could not be forgiven.
Right.
I mean, why do you think you were
Yeah.
treated so
I would,
differently than him?
because it's easier to blame the victim. It's easier to blame the victim. I think they looked at me as this young thing that seduced him. He had a family. They didn't want to ruin his family life. I also think that when you are personally involved with the pastor like they were, they don't want to confront him. They want to believe him. Um, and so, he's a man that baptized their children. He married them. He may have sat with them in counseling. So they had this personal connection with him, and they don't want to believe the accusations. And even if they believe the accusations, they misuse scripture by saying, well, God forgives all of us. We should forgive him. Or we've all sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. So we should not judge this man based on this one mistake. Well, it's not a mistake. It is a deliberate evil act perpetrated by a man that should have been trusted in the church. And yet
Right,
they don't want to do that. It's
right.
a professional violation. It could be the moral side of it. It's a professional violation. He broke the code of ethics of vows were thrown out the window when he committed this act. And we have to remember, if he loses his position, it's only because of his own actions, not because of anything anyone else did. But I have to tell you, it is sad for me when I talk to victims how many times they're blamed. Or if they're not blamed overtly, they're told things like, well, it might be better if you found another church home. Or, everybody makes mistakes and we forgive you. Victims have nothing that they should be forgiven for. We didn't do
Exactly.
anything. We were
Exactly.
trapped. We were trapped by a man of God who claimed to be a man of God. And that's the one thing I would try to say to victims. Whatever you have to do to get it out of your mind, there was nothing you could have done to prevent what happened. You were you were targeted, you were groomed, you were manipulated, you were in a vulnerable state, and they took advantage of that. And whatever coping skills you had or didn't have at the time, you did the best you did for what you could at the time. And it's never, ever, ever your fault. And I had to deal with that for 27 years. I never told anyone about this. My husband didn't know. And for 27 years, I carried the guilt and shame, assuming that I had an affair with a pastor who was married with two children. That's the guilt I carried with. And it was horrible to live like that for 27 years.
I not only do I blame the pastor, but those two elders that knew what was going on and didn't step up and do the right thing, they're just as guilty, in my opinion. Agree with that?
Okay, I lost you for just a second.
Okay, let's pause
Just,
that.
yeah,
I
asking
would
me, I'm
I
sorry.
was gonna
I don't know
say
what this,
I was gonna say
I,
that those two elders that knew about this relationship, they didn't step up and do what they were supposed to do either. I mean, they're just as guilty.
no, and oftentimes, no, there, if not more so, because it was their responsibility to handle this situation properly and take care of the victim. No, absolutely. The church is, and I have said the response of that church probably had more of a devastating effect on my spiritual life than the actions of that pastor. I sat in a room with these two elders and basically were told I was unfit to be in that church. And to me, that probably had more of an effect on my life than what he ever did to me. And when I confronted his, when I confronted this man, I confronted him 27 years later. I hired a private investigator to find him. His boss was sitting in the room at the time, and no one in his current church was aware of his past. And that's unacceptable. You can't hide these men. You're not, that's not your right to do that, to keep someone in a position like that without at least informing the congregation. This is a man who's had this past. And if you want to sit in the pews and listen to him and give your money, I guess that's okay. But you cannot keep that information from the congregation. And that's what they were doing. I basically told them, I'm going to write the elders of that church, his church, which I did. And
Right.
I wrote 11 elders, told them who I was, why I was concerned, and guess how many responded?
Nobody responded? Is that
Nobody. I got it.
wow.
And I think that's another thing they try to think of with victims is, well, if we ignore her, she'll go away. She'll go away. Um, and I didn't go away. I ended up going to the president of the denomination, which got me nowhere as well. Well, I felt that I had at least tried to make it, warn these people that you've got a predator in your midst and he's not a good person. This is not someone you should trust.
Right. Now, before we talk about your book, what was the trigger that after 27 years uh, that allowed you to tell a friend, like you said, not even your husband knew about it. What triggered this?
I was driving out of town to a golf tournament that my daughter was playing in Tennessee. And I passed the sign, an exit sign off the highway of Queens Gate, Tennessee. And that's the church that he moved to after he left our church. And so when I saw that sign, it said to me, oh my God, this is where he lives. This is where he moved to. And I just fell apart. It was on the exploded. I had semis flying past me. I couldn't barely get out of the car. I just fell to the side of the road and sobbed on the highway for probably 30 minutes. And I didn't understand it, why I was feeling this way, because for 27 years, I'd kind of control of these emotions. And at this point, it just all exploded. But it was that trigger of seeing the town, the sign to where he had moved after he left our church. And I didn't know if he was still there, but the thought of being in the same area where he was now, just, I was overtaken with emotion. And at that point, I understood that I was going to have to do something with this, that it wasn't going to go back.
Yeah. What was the reaction from your friends and your husband? Or what was their once you told them what happened? What was their reaction?
My friends were very, very supportive. They came with a box of tissues and let me cry, and we talked and we talked and we talked. I will say it took me probably 20 minutes to get the words out. I was sexually abused by my youth pastor. I was so afraid to still say those words because in the back of my mind, I could still hear him saying, don't ever tell, don't ever tell. And you know, keeping that secret for 27 years and to finally say those words, while it was freeing, it was also terrifying for me. But they were very supportive. They were absolutely shocked at it because my life seemed to be in such order. I had a great family, two great kids. I was active in the community. I was, did a lot of things that, would be normal in a suburban life. So they were very surprised by the news that I had been sexually abused. My husband couldn't have been any more supportive, but I had such a great fear in telling him, not because deep down I knew that he loved me, but I knew he was the one person that if he did judge me or he would question why I kept this secret or wonder why I hadn't told him sooner, I couldn't risk losing him. And that was such a fear, an unfounded fear, but it was a fear. But he couldn't have been any more supportive. He wanted to go kill the guy. And said to me at one point, I don't know why you don't want to go down there and kill him. And then, of course, he said quickly, but you can't do that.
Yeah.
So yeah, my fear too was that he would see me different sexually because, I kept this from him. Would he
Yeah.
see me differently that way? I mean, I had a lot of unfounded fears, but that's what happens when you've been traumatized and you have been systematically told over and over again, you're unworthy of being loved. And I couldn't risk losing his love. And I was again, he was very supportive when I told him that I was going to confront my abuser. I think that concerned him. He was worried that, I wouldn't get the satisfaction out of it that I was hoping to get. And I think he was worried that I would have too many, my expectations would be too high. And that was reality.
That leads me to my next question. I think everybody's kind of got the same question that I have. So we'll backtrack a little. You said you hired an investigator, and that investigator, let's start with that investigator. That was before you ever had contact with the pastor. So the investigator contacted him. What was the result
Yes.
of that what was the result of that conversation?
I lost you.
Oh, okay.
Okay, you'll need to
let me
sorry,
repeat
you'll need to
that.
repeat it.
Let me repeat that because we're having a little bit of technical difficulties with the audio portion. Okay, so Sandy, can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can.
Okay, so everybody's probably got the same question that's on my mind. You hired an investigator to contact him, the pastor, and he did. What was the result of that conversation?
Well, my investigator indicated to me that he was very upset, very nervous. He said that he was sorry for what he had done. He knew that he had hurt me, but that he did not want to meet with me. He would do whatever it was I needed, he hoped that he could do over the phone, but he did not want to meet with me. My investigator was very adamant about the fact that, yes, she wants to meet you. In fact, that was one of my fears, that he would refuse to see me. To which my husband replied, well, he doesn't see you. You're going to tell him you're going to go see the church secretary, the church custodian. Somebody's going to hear your story, whether he wants to hear it or not. He eventually agreed to meet me. He asked if his boss could come along. He asked if his current wife could come along. He had since his first wife divorced him. And we had the meeting. And this is kind of a funny part of the story, I guess. I just randomly picked October 24th. I said, that's the date I want to meet him. It's a Sunday, and that's the date we're going to meet. We meet on a different day because I'm going to be busy that day because it's Minister Appreciation Day.
Oh, wow.
How ironic.
That is
But I would pick Minister Appreciation Day.
You couldn't make that one up.
No, you couldn't. So I basically said, nope, that's the day we're going to meet. And so we did meet. He brought his second wife, and he brought his boss to the meeting. I had my husband, a friend of mine who was a counselor, and then another friend of mine who was at the church at the time. Because one of the things that, in confronting him, while that took a lot of courage on my part, the one thing I knew he couldn't do was deny it because he'd been caught. So unlike a lot of victims who will confront their abusers, they won't be met. I wasn't going to be met with things like, well, you've misunderstood something, or that never happened, or I don't know what you're talking about. He was he didn't have that defense. He had to face me and face the fact that, yes, he did sexually abuse me.
Yeah. And so what was his story? What did he say? I'm
Well,
sorry.
like all narcissists, he became the victim. He talked about he had an alcoholic father, he had issues in his life, he'd been to see a counselor, and he had been identified as a sexual addict, and that's the why he did what he did. Um, he then looked at me and said, not for my sake, but for your sake, you need to forgive me. I mean, that's something you never say to a victim, especially coming from the user, which just angered me to a point that I can't even describe.
Can imagine.
But I did understand that if I was going to heal from this, I had to find a way to forgive him. Um, so I gave him a list of things to read. I told him, I said, well, I do need to try to forgive you, and I'm going to try to do that, but I can't forgive you unless you know exactly what you did to me. So I gave him a list of 20 things to read. You were wrong when you kissed me in my hallway. You were wrong when you hit me. You were wrong when you controlled the things I said and did. I went through a whole litany of 20 things and made him read that list to me. He got to the end of it and said, well, I don't know that I believe all this or remember all of this. And then my husband just shot up at him and said, listen, I've known this woman for 30 years, and if she says it happened, it happened. So he didn't show any remorse. It was all about him. Um, I'm totally convinced he has no idea what he did to my spiritual life. He could not articulate in any way what he had done. And if he truly were a repentant, understanding man, he wouldn't have himself in the ministry. I mean, he would remove himself knowing what he's capable of doing. And he hasn't done that. He continues in ministry. He's semi-retired now, but he's still in good standing in the Disciples of Christ Church. He can preach anytime he wants. And that's, to me, that's very sad. And that was really hard for me to get over, knowing that justice wouldn't happen, that I was never going to get justice for what he did to me. Um, that's what life is sometimes. Yeah.
Sandy, was there ever a time when you thought maybe I should call the authorities in?
I did look into that, and I did file a civil suit against him. The statute of limitation had run out. That's the problem. The different states vary with this, but in Ohio, the statute of limitations at that time was after you turned 18, you had 2 years in which to file a suit against your abuser. Now think about that. That means you've got to be 20 years old, have the financial wherewithal and the emotional stability to go after your abuser. And that's not going to happen. The
No.
average age for victims of child abuse to come forward is 52. That's the average age to come forward. The statute of limitations has run out long, long ago on most cases. There are some states, I think there's 13 of them, that there is no statute of limitations on child abuse. In Ohio, there is a statute of limitations. It's now up to 28, so you've got 10 years after you turn 18. But at the time, it was 2 years after you turned 18. So I did file a civil suit. Basically, that was just to put his name on a registry to say that there was enough evidence that this did happen. They refused to put it on the registry because at the time, 16 was an age of consent in Ohio, and it's no longer. It's 18 now. But if he had been my school teacher instead of my pastor, it wouldn't have mattered. But pastors didn't fall under that requirement, so to speak. So
Wow.
there was a lot of loopholes that allowed him to get away with this,
Yeah.
basically.
Yeah. He pretty much skated.
Yeah.
You wrote the book, Let Me Pray Upon You. It's Prey for the folks out there. Why did you decide to write it?
Yeah.
What was the spark to set you off to write it? And tell us, what do you hope the readers take away from reading it?
Well, and this is the book. I love the title because it just, to me, shows exactly what happens. It's a wolf after the little lamb. And
Yeah.
I wrote the book because I was so frustrated by hearing stories of abuse, and people were responding by saying things like, well, why do these women wait so long? Or why didn't they just say no? Or why do they think that after all these years they can come forward and accuse these men of doing these things? I was so frustrated by the lack of understanding of how victims are traumatized and respond. So that was one of the reasons I wrote the book. And then the second reason was that I was working with victims at the time, and I understood that my story was important, and that by telling my story, I was helping other people. So many times people would say to me, oh my gosh, your story is so compelling, you really should write a book. Well, I'm not a writer. I jokingly tell people my teacher is turning over in her grave at the thought that I wrote a book. But I just felt the need that my story needed to be to all of our stories are important. Your story is important. And if we can share those stories in some small way, we're going to help other people. And that's why I wrote the book. And at this point, I've discovered that it has been a help. But I did write it again. I wanted to be an educational book as well to help people understand how clergy abuse works.
Yeah, definitely. And it's a good thing you wrote it. Now, for people out there, Sandy, what should one say or not say to a victim of clergy abuse? If somebody knows that it
So
happened
one
to
of
a
the first things
friend of
that
theirs or
people
whatever.
who are in a spiritual setting, a religious setting, they want to use spiritual terms to help a victim of clergy abuse. It's the worst thing you can do. Instead of saying to a victim of clergy abuse, I'll pray for you, it's better to ask, would it be okay if I pray for you? And don't be surprised by the answer of no. We were abused by someone who melded themselves into a godlike creature and took God as a part of that. And as I told you earlier, I had sex in the church. So those kinds of things are triggers for us. Anything with a religious connotation are usually triggers. So to say to someone, oh, I'll pray for you, or when they say, well, the Bible says God will, da da da, those, I actually freeze up when I hear those kinds of terms. So
Yeah,
it's important, and I know that most people are well-intended, but they're not helpful to a victim of clergy abuse. Second thing is, if you come across someone who's been abused by someone in clergy, one of the best things you can say to them is, it was not your fault. I don't understand everything that how it happened, but I'm wanting to understand. And I want you to know that you can tell me your story without any kind of judgment, because we so fear we're going to be judged by what was done to us. So it's important to let that victim know you're not going to judge them, and that you're willing to listen to them and understand that they're going to tell their not ready to tell the entire story. My friends would listen and I'd say, well, I'm going to tell you about this part of my story. And so even writing the book, it was a little difficult to put out there everything that had happened to me by the hands of this man. But those are the kinds of things that I think are important for people to understand when they're talking to a victim of clergy abuse.
right. Now, if a person out there is alerted to clergy sexual abuse being perpetrated, what process or actions do you suggest they pursue?
Well, I think it's important if you have legal action to take that. If you, I also think if you uh, have a need, if you've not discussed or told anyone your story, you need to tell your story. You need to tell someone, but I would suggest not going through someone in the church. You need to tell someone outside of the church. Again, because they're going to be supportive of the minister or the pastor or the rabbi. But I think legal action is if you've got the financial wherewithal to do that. I also think it's important to educate yourself. There's plenty of information on the internet. There are many books out there. I can recommend a few, but healing is what you need to do. Healing is your most important aspect at this point, and you do whatever that would lead you to a better place in your life. And taking legal action may not be the first place. Sometimes you just need to heal yourself. Counseling is most important. Um, I think does that answer your question pretty much?
Yeah, yeah, it does. Uh, I know you serve on the board of Council on Child Abuse, and you're a volunteer for the Hope of Survivors Ministry. Can you tell us a little bit about those organizations and your advocacy work with them?
The Hope of Survivors Ministry is one that I contacted shortly after I yeah, I work mostly with they work mostly with adult women who've been abused by clergy. I speak at their conferences. I've dealt with some of their I've worked with some of their victims. It's a wonderful organization. They have a great website. It is religiously based, so I want to warn victims that if that's a trigger for you, there are other websites that you can go to. I also serve on the Council of Child Abuse, and what we do is go into the schools and teach kids about good touch, bad touch, talk to them about sexual abuse, and we also talk to them about bullying. So it's important, the time of my abuse, this wasn't talked about. There wasn't the internet, there wasn't Oprah, it wasn't a topic that anyone even thought about. And so it's great now that we have these avenues that we are a little bit more open about it, and people can talk about it, and it helps victims come forward a little bit easier than it did in my time. Because I always said, if I'd heard someone's story when my own abuse was happening, maybe it would have given me the courage to speak up, and maybe I would have had, a way out that I didn't feel I had at the time if I had known there was someone else out there. I mean, I thought I was the only one in the world this was ever happening to. And even
Right.
victims today, even though it's out there, will still say, I just felt alone. I just felt like no one else was going through the same thing I was going through.
Yeah, yeah.
So but I would encourage victims, the first thing you do is educate yourself. Learn what manipulation is in grooming and gaslighting. Because once you understand what was done to you, the idea that you could have changed anything or there was something you could have done to prevent it. The best thing you can do is educate yourself and find everything, learn everything you can, read everything you can about clergy abuse. And again, if you just Google it, you'll find all kinds of wonderful information out there.
Sandy, lastly, how are churches uh, failing dealing with clergy abuse, and also what are they doing right, if anything?
The Presbyterian Church has a very good strict policy on clergy abuse. I would recommend reading their policy. It's well written and they stick to that policy. Part of the problem is churches don't have a policy. They go by the seat of their pants when something happens. They have no clue what they're doing. There needs to be a policy in place as to what is appropriate behavior, what they expect of these pastors, not to be left alone with certain children or even counseling women by themselves. So some of that is happening. The problem with churches is they tend to want to deal with this as a moral issue. It's a professional violation. If you look at it just as a moral issue, then the church is very good about forgiving, for giving second chances and talking about how God forgives. But that's okay. But the point is, it's a professional violation. So he loses that privilege of his job, and they don't want to go to that degree. They want to give them second chances, and that's the biggest failure of all. These men do not deserve a second chance. They can be forgiven by God, but they're forgiven sitting in the church or sitting in the last row of the church of the pew, not standing in the pulpit. They don't belong there, and churches are not ready to go to that step yet. Some of them have some very good policies. But policies are only as good as if you implement them. You've got to be able to follow through. A lot of churches, like the church I grew up in, don't have a hierarchy. So each individual church determines who gets hired, who gets fired, how they handle these situations. So they can be moved around very easily in many Protestant churches because there's no hierarchy to report to. Now, having said that, the Catholic Church has probably one of the best hierarchies in the world, and that didn't prevent them from hiding them and moving them to different parishes.
Yeah, and I think people listening to this who are involved in their houses of worship can take what Sandy just said and start thinking about, if you don't have a policy, about writing a policy. Very good suggestion. Uh, Sandy, how can people contact you if they want to contact you?
I have a website. It's just simply my name, which is Sandy, Sandy Phillips, Phillips, and then it's Kirkham, KIRKHAM.com. That's the website. I've got a lot of good information on there. I'm also on a Facebook page, same thing. My name, Sandy Phillips Kirkham. My book is available on Amazon. It's also available through my web. So that's basically the best way to contact me. And I'm
Okay.
happy, if you email me, I'll respond back. There's a victim out there who needs to talk.
Okay. What is that email address, Sandy?
But it's on my website. It would be the same. It's a
It's on your
Gmail
website?
account.
Okay.
Yeah, it's on my
Okay.
website.
Okay.
Yeah.
We're gonna put your website and your book is going to be in our podcast notes. So for everybody listening out there,
Okay.
it'll be in the podcast notes. Sandy, I want to thank you for being on the podcast and talking with us on this most sensitive topic that is not discussed enough. I want to wish you all the best going forward with your advocacy work on this topic and wish you well in your future endeavors. Comments and suggestions for the podcast, you can email me at itsarapwithrap@gmail.com. We have a Facebook group, It's a Rap with Rap. We have about 2,000 members there. We're on Instagram, It's a Rap with Rap podcast. We're on X or Twitter at Rapper, WRAPPER 130. Also, we have a YouTube channel. All the episodes are on YouTube. It's a Rap with Rap, the podcast uncut. I want to thank everyone for listening. Sandy, I want to thank you once again for making yourself vulnerable and coming on. We really appreciate you having you on. And I want to thank everyone for
Thank
listening.
you.
Thank you. I want to thank everyone for listening. Please stay safe. And for now, it's a wrap.